Hey guys, tonight we are setting out together on a slow winding journey into ancient wisdom. You'll hear Zen stories and Buddhist teachings that have been whispered across centuries, not as distant relics, but as living threads that can still wrap around your heart tonight. Imagine you're stepping onto a quiet path just after sunset. The air is cool enough to make you pull your blanket a little higher, and somewhere far away, a night bird calls once and then falls silent. You're safe here. Nothing urgent is waiting. Only the sound of my voice and the stories we're about to walk through together. If you've been carrying the weight of the day, the small worries that pile up like unwashed dishes in the sink of your mind tonight, you get to set them down. You don't need to fix anything. You don't even need to try to relax. It will happen all on its own. And before we begin, take a moment to let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from and what time is it right now where you are? I love picturing this web of people stretched across cities and countries, all here in the same quiet space for a little while. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1893. A slow-moving steamship pushes through the restless waters of the Pacific Ocean, its steel belly groaning softly as waves roll beneath. The wooden deck hums faintly under your feet from the deep churn of the propellers far below. Salt spray lingers in the air, leaving a fine grit on your lips if you stand too close to the railing. Above, gulls circle lazily, their cries fading in and out against the low thrum of the engines. Somewhere near the bow, leaning quietly against the ship's railing, is a man unlike any of the other passengers. His head is shaved smooth. His robe loose and flowing shifts with the ocean breeze, a muted brown against the endless silver blue of sky and water. This is Soyen Shaku, the first Zen master to ever set foot on American soil. He's not traveling for trade, nor for politics, but for something quieter and far harder to explain. In a few weeks, he will stand before scholars and spiritual leaders from all over the world at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. But for now, he simply stands here breathing in the horizon. In his hands, a small leather-bound journal flutters open in the wind. He writes in delicate Japanese characters, each brushstroke steady despite the sway of the ship. These aren't travel notes or idle thoughts. They are his principles, the distilled truths that shape the way he lives, written for no audience but himself. A young man approaches D.T. Suzuki, his devoted student and traveling companion. At this moment, Suzuki is still unknown outside Japan, but in years to come, he will be celebrated for introducing Zen to the West. He bows deeply. Master. He says many of the Americans we will meet admire Zen philosophy, but they wonder, how can it be lived? How can it be practiced every day? Soyen Shaku closes his journal, looking at his student with a gaze that is both warm and unflinching. I am writing my own rules for daily life, he says. Not lofty philosophy, but simple actions that hold Zen at their core. Suzuki hesitates. May I see them. Without a trace of pride or hesitation, Soyen hands him the journal. Suzuki scans the list, his expression shifting from surprise to quiet awe. The first reads, "In the morning before dressing, light incense and meditate. Before even putting on clothes, begin the day in stillness. Let breath come before busyness. Another, eat with moderation, never to the point of fullness. Don't dull the mind with excess. Leave space for alertness, for gratitude. One more, receive a guest as if you were alone. When alone, behave as if you were receiving a guest. A call to live without masks, without shifting between a public and private self. Some seem almost severe, retire at a regular hour. Do not regret the past. When an opportunity comes, do not let it pass by yet. Think twice before acting. Others are strangely poetic. Have the fearless attitude of a hero and the loving heart of a child." And the final one, upon retiring, sleep as if it were your last sleep. Upon awakening, rise instantly as if you had cast away an old pair of shoes. Suzuki looks up. "Master, these are so ordinary, and yet they feel complete." The most profound truths, Soyen replies, are often the most simple. But simple is not the same as easy. He turns back toward the ocean where sky and water meet in a seamless, unbroken line. "The Americans will expect something exotic," he says quietly. "But if they live by these rules, they will understand Zen without ever speaking its name." The wind shifts, catching the pages again, and for a moment, it's as if the principles themselves are being carried across the ocean, ready to take root in an entirely different world. Imagine you're there, feeling the deck sway beneath your feet. The air is sharp with salt, and in your hands is that journal, not as a relic, but as a living set of instructions that could be opened on any morning anywhere in the world. Maybe you would follow them exactly, or maybe they'd simply remind you that how you move through small moments, waking, eating, meeting others, is where your life is truly lived. As the ship presses on toward the American coast, you notice Soyen Shaku slip the journal back into his robe. There's nothing left to write for now, only to live. And as night falls over the ocean, you can almost hear him thinking, principles are not meant to be displayed. They are meant to be embodied. But what happens when these principles are tested not by distance or by culture, but by challenge? When the very heart of compassion is questioned to its core. That is where our next story begins. The afternoon sun hangs heavy over the dusty road leading to a small village near the city of Sravasti. The air shimmers with heat, bending the outlines of distant trees. A faint breeze carries the mingled scents of cooking fires, ripe fruit, and warm earth. Birds chatter lazily in the shade, their voices floating above the low hum of village life. From the far side of the road, a crowd begins to gather, merchants and farmers, old men leaning on sticks, children darting between the adults' legs. They are following a figure who walks at the center of it all. His head is shaven, his robe a soft saffron that catches the light without glare. His pace is neither hurried nor slow, but perfectly measured. Even from a distance you can feel it. The way the space around him seems to still, as if the noise of the day lowers itself in his presence. This is Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, walking with his disciples. There is no ceremony, no grand procession, just the quiet rhythm of feet on packed earth. As they approach the shade of a great banyan tree, the Buddha pauses. His followers instinctively gather in a loose circle, allowing him a moment of rest. An attendant offers a wooden bowl of water. The Buddha accepts it with a small nod. No words, no flourish. That's when she appears. An elderly woman bent with age, moving slowly but deliberately toward the group. Her robe is plain, her bundle of sticks tied with rough twine. She sets the load down beside her with a sigh, then straightens as much as her spine will allow and looks directly at the Buddha. Her eyes are bright, and they are not filled with reverence. So she says, her voice stronger than her frame, "You are the one they call the Buddha, the one who teaches kindness toward all beings." "I am," he replies simply. The woman steps closer. "They say your compassion has no limits, that you treat all creatures equally." Her tone sharpens. "But I have been watching you pass through our village for years, and I see nothing unusual about your kindness. When people praise you, you smile. When they speak gently, you answer gently. Anyone can be kind to those who are kind to them. Even tax collectors manage that much." Around the circle, the disciples shift uneasily. Some glance at each other as if to say, "Should we step in?" But the Buddha's expression does not change. No trace of defensiveness, no hint of anger. The woman takes a breath and delivers her challenge plainly. "Show me this great compassion of yours, or admit that it's nothing more than polite manners." The Buddha smiles, not the tight smile of someone enduring an insult, but the soft curve of genuine appreciation. "You are right," he says. "Kindness that only mirrors kindness is not what I teach." He tilts his head. "Tell me, if someone offers you a gift and you refuse it, who does the gift belong to?" She blinks, caught off guard. "To the one who offered it, of course. If I don't take it, it stays with them." The Buddha nods. "And so it is with anger and with criticism. If I do not accept what you offer, it remains yours." The words land like a stone dropped into a still pond, a quiet ripple passing through the circle of listeners. The old woman's shoulders ease just slightly. She had expected pushback or retreat. She had not expected this. "You don't deny my criticism," she presses. "Not at all," the Buddha says. "If it is true, it's worth hearing, no matter how it is spoken. And if it is not, I have no need to hold it. And maybe this is a moment for you to think about your own life. Has someone ever offered you words that stung, but when you looked closely, carried a seed of truth? If a part of the story stirs something in you, share it in the comments. Sometimes the lesson we resist the most is the one we need to hear." The old woman studies him for a long moment. Her face softens into something almost like a smile. Perhaps she says, quietly, "There is more to your teaching than I thought." She bends to lift her bundle of sticks, and the Buddha steps forward, taking part of the weight. For an instant, their hands meet on the rough twine. Two people connected not by agreement or admiration, but by the simple act of sharing a burden. The disciples watch as she walks away toward the village, her back a little straighter than before. The Buddha turns to them and says, "That woman is one of our greatest teachers. She has reminded us that compassion is not a trade between friends. It is an openness that makes no distinction between praise and blame." And you wonder, if compassion can look like this steady, unshaken, even when challenged, what might it look like when the challenge is not with words, but with the deepest kind of frustration, the kind that burns quietly for years until it suddenly flares into something unstoppable? That is the story we're about to walk into next. Snow falls in slow, deliberate spirals through a slate-colored sky. Each flake lands without sound, settling on the dark wood of temple roofs and the pale stone of winding paths. The air is sharp, almost metallic, carrying the faint scent of cedar smoke from somewhere deep within the monastery grounds. You walk across the courtyard, your breath puffing into tiny clouds that vanish as quickly as they form. Somewhere inside the meditation hall, a wooden fish drum beats in slow, steady pulses, tok tok tok, marking the rhythm for seated practice. From the far edge of the courtyard, a figure approaches through the snow. His straw sandals crunch softly against the white crust. This is Kyogen, a monk in his mid-30s, tall for his time. His face drawn tight with the kind of concentration that's less about calm and more about strain. For 15 years, he has devoted himself to the teachings, memorizing sutras, practicing meditation without fail, and wrestling day and night with a single Zen koan. What was your original phase before your parents were born? To most, the question sounds strange, even absurd. But for Kyogen, it is the doorway. The one thing that, if passed through, will bring the understanding he has been chasing for half his life. Today, his frustration is heavier than the snow gathering on his shoulders. When he reaches the steps of the meditation hall, his teacher, Master Isan, is already waiting. Isan's robe hangs loosely on his wiry frame. His hair is silver, his gaze bright. He sees Kyogen's urgency before a single word is spoken. They bow to each other, and then Kyogen begins. "Master, I have done everything. I have studied. I have practiced. I have memorized the words and sat until my legs went numb. But still I cannot answer the question. I am at my limit." Isan's voice is quiet. "If I explained it to you, it would be my understanding, not yours." Kyogen's eyes tighten. "Then what more can I possibly do?" The master looks out toward the snow falling over the courtyard. If a man climbs to the top of a 100-foot pole, he asks, how can he take one step further? The question hits Kyogen like a sudden gust. Not an answer, but another riddle, one that seems even more impossible. "I don't know," he admits. "I have climbed as high as I can." Isan meets his gaze, then let go. For weeks afterward, Kyogen moves through the monastery like a man with a stone in his chest. He works in the garden. He carries water from the well. But in his mind, the same image repeats, standing at the top of a 100-foot pole with nowhere to go except to let go. And then, one morning, while sweeping a path in the bamboo grove, it happens. His broom knocks loose a small stone. It skips once, twice, and strikes the hollow stalk of a bamboo. Tok. The sound is pure, complete. Nothing missing. Nothing extra. Kyogen freezes, and in that instant, the weight he's carried for 15 years drops away. His broom slips from his hands. Laughter bubbles up, strange at first, then unstoppable. The laughter of someone who has been searching everywhere for something, only to realize it was here all along. That evening, he goes to Master Isan's quarters. I heard a stone strike bamboo, he says, and all my questions vanished. The master smiles, and the 100-foot pole, Kyogen, shakes his head gently. There is no pole, no climber, no step to take. They share a silent bow. Nothing more needs to be said. Sometimes the sound that changes your life is as small as a stone tapping bamboo. It doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't even have to be special, only clear. If you've ever had a moment like that, share it in the comments. Your story might be the stone someone else needs to hear. Kyogen would go on to teach others with the same unshakable calm he had found that day. But not all lessons arrive wrapped in gentle sounds or quiet revelations. Some come with the slow, unmistakable pull of a question you didn't even know you needed to ask, until someone stands in front of you and forces you to see the answer in a reflection. And that's exactly where our next story begins. The streets of 15th century Kyoto glow softly under a canopy of paper lanterns. From the grand houses of the merchant district comes the warm spill of light, the scent of grilled river fish, and the faint, elegant notes of a bamboo flute. In one of these houses, a sprawling mansion, lined with polished wood and gleaming lacquer preparations are underway for a dinner that must impress. The host, a wealthy silk merchant, moves through the rooms with a nervous precision. He straightens a cushion here, adjusts the placement of a sake bottle there. Tonight's guest of honor is no nobleman, no political ally, but a monk. Not just any monk, Ikkyu, the wild-haired Zen master whose wit and wisdom are as unpredictable as the wind. When Ikkyu arrives, the room stills. His robe is worn and plain. His hair, unbound and untamed, falls in dark waves around his face. He carries no gifts, no scrolls, no formalities. Only a wooden begging bowl in one hand, as if he has wandered in by accident. The merchant bows deeply, his voice tight with relief. Master Ikkyu, what an honor to have you in my home. Ikkyu nods once, then steps inside. The conversations around the room pick back up, but in a lower, more cautious register. Servants bring dish after exquisite dish lacquered trays, holding delicacies from every corner of Japan. And yet, Ikkyu eats slowly, quietly. He offers no praise for the lavish spread. He offers no criticism either. The silence makes the merchant uneasy. Finally, in the middle of the evening, Ikkyu sets down his chopsticks. Honored host, he says, may I trouble you for a cup of water from your well? The merchant blinks, startled. Water. from the well. Master, we have the finest sake. I would prefer to draw it myself, Ikkyu interrupts gently. Curiosity ripples through the guests. Several follow as the merchant leads Ikkyu out into the garden. The night air is crisp. Above them, the moon hangs full and bright, silvering the tips of the pines and the stone lanterns along the path. At the far end of the garden stands the well, a simple stone circle, worn smooth by centuries of hands drawing water. When they reach it, Ikkyu leans over the edge. Far below, the water reflects the moon perfectly. Look, he says. What do you see? One guest answers, the moon. Another adds, reflected perfectly as if it were resting on the water. Ikkyu nods. The moon travels thousands of miles through the heavens, yet here it rests perfectly still in this humble well. The moon does not choose where to shine. It shows its light to all the emperor's lake and the poorest puddle alike. He lowers the bucket slowly, the pulley creaking in the quiet. When he draws it back up, the moon's reflection trembles, then reforms on the water's surface. He drinks deeply, the sound echoing in the night air. Delicious, he sighs, more refreshing than the finest sake. Then his gaze turns to the merchant. This water gives itself freely. It asks nothing in return, no matter who drinks it. Can you say the same of your hospitality? The merchant's smile falters. He lowers his eyes. I invited you to impress my guests, not to give freely. Ikkyu smiles not with judgment, but with recognition. Then tonight, perhaps you have found a better gift than any you planned. They return to the banquet, but the air has changed. The merchant moves among his guests without the weight of performance, speaking openly, laughing freely. Sometimes generosity is measured not in what we give, but in whether we expect something back. Has there been a time when you gave or received without strings attached? If you feel like sharing, write it in the comments. Your story might remind someone else how light giving can feel when nothing is owed in return. Later, as the guests depart, the merchant bows to Ikkyu. You came with nothing, he says, and yet you've given me the most valuable gift I've ever received. Ikkyu's eyes flick toward the garden. I gave you nothing you didn't already have. I merely pointed to the well in your own yard. But sometimes, the thing we chase most, peace, wisdom, awakening, is like that moon. It can't be held in a bucket no matter how carefully we carry it. And in the story that follows, a young nun will discover exactly that. The moon is so bright tonight that it seems to paint the entire temple courtyard in silver. It hangs low in the sky, glowing with the kind of stillness that makes you want to stop moving just to watch it. A light breeze stirs the tops of the pine trees, carrying the scent of resin and cool mountain air. It's long past the hour when most of the nuns have gone to their sleeping quarters, but one figure still moves quietly among the shadows. Her robe brushes against the stone path, her steps measured, careful. This is Chiono, a young nun who has spent years studying the Dharma, meditating each day, and seeking what her teachers call direct realization. Despite her dedication, something in her practice feels incomplete. It's not that she doubts the Buddha's words or the guidance of her elders, but every time she sits in meditation, she feels like she's looking at the truth through a pane of glass she can't break. Tonight, she has taken it upon herself to fetch water from the eastern well. Not as a chore, but as another chance to practice mindfulness. She carries an old wooden bucket in one hand, its handle smooth from years of use. When she reaches the well, she pauses. The stone rim is cool under her fingers. She leans forward, and there it is, the moon perfectly reflected in the water below. She stares for a long time, feeling that strange closeness again, as if she could touch something infinite. If only she could reach far enough. Slowly she lowers the bucket. The rope slides over her palms, rough against her skin. With a soft splash, the bucket meets the water, shattering the moon's image into ripples. As she draws it back up, the reflection reforms, trembling slightly as the bucket sways. Halfway along the path back to the kitchen, she notices a dark wetness against her robe. She stops, tilts the bucket, and sees it a small crack at the base, leaking thin streams of water. She quickens her pace, hoping to save as much as she can. But then it happens. Without warning, the bottom of the bucket gives way entirely. A rush of cold water cascades down her legs, soaking her sandals and splashing against the stone path. The bucket swings light and empty in her hands. Chiyono freezes. Her eyes drop to the puddles forming around her feet, each one holding its own tiny fragment of the moon. Dozens of them. Hundreds. The moon is everywhere, just as full and luminous as before, only no longer contained in one single vessel. Her breath catches. In that moment, the glass she'd felt in her practice for years shatters. The truth is not something to be captured, held, or stored away. Like the moon's reflection, it is always there, whether or not we have a bucket to carry it. The water was never the moon. The bucket was never the truth. She stands perfectly still in the moonlight, soaked to the bone, her empty hands suddenly feeling more full than they ever have. Later, she will try to put the experience into words. Her poem will read, "In this way and that, I tried to save the old pail, since the bamboo strip was weakening and about to break, until at last the bottom fell out. No more water in the pail, no more moon in the water. Sometimes the thing we've been chasing is already present, even when what we're holding on to falls apart." Has there been a time in your life when losing something showed you it was never the source of what you truly valued? If you feel like sharing, tell your story in the comments. You never know who might need to hear it tonight. From that night on, the other nuns noticed something different in Chiyono. Her movements became unhurried but precise. Her smile unforced her presence. Spacious. She no longer strained toward awakening. She let it meet her in every step, every breath, every drop of water she touched. But while Chiyono's moment came, with the gentle release of water on stone, not all teachings arrive so softly. Some are delivered with the weight of a lifetime's discipline and the quiet refusal to let even old age stand in the way of practice. And that is where we'll go next. The first light of dawn spills gently over the monastery's tiled roofs, washing the courtyards in pale gold. Mist clings low to the vegetable garden, curling around the rows of leafy greens and the rough wooden stakes that hold up climbing beans. Somewhere nearby, a single rooster calls out, its voice echoing against the hills. At the far end of the garden, bent over a patch of weeds, is a man in his 80s. His back is straight despite the years, his hands moving with a steady rhythm. Pull, shake, place the weeds in a basket. This is Master Hayakujo, one of the most respected Zen teachers of his time. Students travel for days to hear him speak, to sit in meditation under his guidance, to catch even a single phrase that might change their lives. And yet, here he is, with dirt under his fingernails before breakfast. A group of younger monks pass by, whispering among themselves, "Shouldn't the master be resting? At his age, why is he still working in the fields?" Later that day, they bring their concern to him directly. "Master," one of them begins, "your teachings are too valuable for you to risk your health with manual labor. Please let us do the work for you." Hayakujo looks up from the row of radishes he's been thinning. His expression is calm, almost amused. "If I do not work," he says, "I do not eat." The monks exchange uneasy glances. They assume he's speaking figuratively about the discipline of practice or the reciprocity of life in the monastery. But the next morning, they decide to put his words to the test. When Hayakujo arrives in the garden after morning meditation, he finds his tools missing. The hoe, the rake, the woven basket, all gone. He looks around, but the younger monks avoid his gaze, pretending to busy themselves elsewhere. That evening, when the meal bell rings, the community gathers in the dining hall. Steaming bowls of rice, fresh greens, and miso soup are passed down the long wooden tables. The scent of sesame oil and pickled vegetables fills the air. But Hayakujo's place is empty. One of the younger monks finds him in his quarters. "Master, the meal has begun." Hayakujo shakes his head gently. "I did no work today. I will eat no food today." The monk protests. "But Master, the work was done for you." "That is not the point," Hayakujo replies. "To live in this body is to participate in the give and take of the world. If I refuse to take part in the labor that sustains us, I break that circle." The monk stands there, unsure what to say. There's no anger in the master's voice, only an unshakable clarity, like a still pond reflecting the sky. By the next morning, the tools are back in their place, and once again, Hayakujo can be found in the garden, hands in the soil breath, steady, as the earth warms under the rising sun. There's a quiet kind of joy in doing the work that connects you to your life, not for recognition, not for praise, but simply because it's part of being here. What's one simple task you do that grounds you even if no one notices? Share it in the comments. You might remind someone else to cherish those quiet labors. Over time, Hayakujo's phrase, "a day without work is a day without food," became more than a rule for the monastery. It became a reminder to live fully engaged with the world, to meet each day with both hands open, ready to give and ready to receive. But the work of tending the body and the land is only one kind of discipline. There is another less visible but just as demanding that involves tending to the mind itself. It's a practice that can begin the moment you wake, and it might start with a conversation with yourself. And that is where our next story takes us. The first light hasn't yet touched the temple walls. Outside, the mountains are still wrapped in a deep blue haze, their peaks disappearing into the last shadows of night. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of damp moss and the faint smoke of a fire that has burned low through the night. Inside his small room, Zuygen sits on a plain cushion. The floorboards are cold under his bare feet, and his robe hangs loose around his thin frame. In the stillness, the sound of his own breath is the only thing that marks the passing of time. Then quietly but firmly, he speaks. Master. His own voice, but directed inward, like calling out across an empty courtyard. From somewhere within himself, the reply comes. Yes. Stay awake. Yes. Do not be deceived by others. Do not be deceived by yourself. Yes. The exchange is short, almost abrupt, but Zuygen repeats it each morning without fail. He has done so for years, and he will continue to do so until his final days. At first glance, it seems strange, even unsettling for a monk to talk to himself in this way. But for Zuygen, this is not self-reassurance. It's self-remembering. In the temple, there are endless opportunities to lose yourself in routine, sweeping the same floors, chanting the same sutras, preparing the same meals. It's easy to drift into a kind of half-sleep, moving, breathing, speaking, without truly being awake. Zuygen's dialogue is his anchor. It's the moment he pulls himself back to the center before the day begins to carry him away. One morning, a younger monk passes by Zuygen's quarters and overhears the strange ritual. Later, curiosity gets the better of him. Master Zuygen, he asks, why do you call to yourself as if you were two people? Zuygen looks at him for a long moment, his gaze both steady and warm. When the one who wanders hears the one who knows, they meet in the middle, he says. Otherwise, the one who knows would be lost among the wandering. The younger monk frowns, unsure if he understands. Zuygen smiles. Imagine walking through a dense fog. You can't see more than a few steps ahead. But if you call out to yourself and answer, you are reminded that someone is still holding the thread. That night, the younger monk tries it. He sits alone in his cell, whispers, "Master," into the still air, and answers himself softly. And though he feels a little foolish, he notices something else too. The fog in his mind lifts, if only slightly. Sometimes we need to call ourselves back, not in a grand way, not with fireworks or revelations, but with a simple reminder. I'm here. I'm paying attention. Do you have a small habit or phrase that helps you remember yourself when you're drifting? If you do, share it in the comments. It might help someone else find their way back. in the middle of their own fog. Over the years, Zweigen's ritual became as much a part of the temple's rhythm as the morning bell. It was quiet, it was private, but it shaped the way he moved through the world, alert, present, unshaken by praise or criticism. Pause let the image of the morning room fade. And yet, even for someone so steady, challenges can come in unexpected forms. Sometimes it's not about being lost in the fog, but about being caught in a belief so absolute that it blinds you to the truth standing right in front of you. Our next story is about a student who believed he had grasped the essence of Zen until his teacher showed him just how far he still had to go. It was late afternoon when Yamaoka Teshu arrived at the temple. The winter sun hung low, casting long, slanting shadows across the stone courtyard. A thin layer of frost clung to the roof tiles, sparkling faintly as he passed beneath the temple gate. Yamaoka was no ordinary visitor. He was a master swordsman, a man whose skill with the blade had earned him a place in the shogun's inner circle. Yet in his heart, he believed there was still something missing. A precision he could not name, a peace he had not yet touched. That day, he sought out Master Dozan, a Zen teacher known for his quiet but unyielding insight. Yamaoka bowed deeply when they met in the garden. Master, he said, I have read hundreds of Zen texts. I have studied the teachings for years, and I believe I have reached the point where no one can teach me more. Dozan looked at him for a long time, his breath a soft cloud in the cold air. Is that so? He said, voice even. Then perhaps you will indulge an old man in a small request. He gestured for Yamaoka to follow him down a narrow path to a small hut at the edge of the temple grounds. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Against the far wall stood a low table with a bamboo flute resting on it. Play for me, Dozan said simply. Yamaoka hesitated. I am no musician. Then do your best, the master replied. So Yamaoka picked up the bamboo flute. Its surface was cool against his fingers. He raised it to his lips and blew, producing a thin, uneven note. He tried again, coaxing a slightly steadier tone. After a few minutes, he set it down. I told you, Master, I cannot play. Dozan smiled faintly. That is true, but do you see? Your breath is untrained. Your attention wanders. And yet, you believed your understanding of Zen was complete. Yamaoka frowned, not used to being spoken to so plainly. Are you saying my mind is like my flute playing unpracticed? The master shook his head. Not unpracticed, but unwilling to see where it still needs practice. You came here with your cup already full. The problem is not that you have no room for more, it's that you believe the cup is already perfect. Dozan reached for the flute himself. He played a single clear note. Not a song, not a melody, just one tone that seemed to fill the hut like warm light. This, he said, comes not from reading about the flute, but from years of putting my breath through it. He handed the flute back. Zen is no different. All the texts, all the philosophy mean nothing if your breath, your living has not passed through them. Yamaoka looked at the flute in his hands, suddenly aware of how awkward it felt, how foreign. He bowed deeply. Then please, Master, teach me how to breathe. And in that humble admission, the swordsman's training began again, from the ground up, not in the dojo, but in the quiet of a bamboo grove, where each note, each breath became a step into understanding. Sometimes the thing that holds us back isn't ignorance, it's thinking we've already arrived. Have you ever had a moment when you thought you knew something completely, only to realize you were just at the beginning? If so, share it in the comments. Your story might encourage someone else to reopen their own cup. In the weeks that followed, Yamaoka's visits to the temple became regular. He learned to sit in stillness without the weight of achievement pressing on him. He learned to bow to each moment not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Pause. Let the scene fade. But not all awakenings happen in the quiet of a hut or the stillness of a bamboo grove. Sometimes they come in the middle of a street in full daylight with no time to prepare, when a single sight shatters the distance between your heart and the suffering of the world. And that is where our next story begins. The morning sun rose over the capital like a slow blooming flower, spilling light across tiled rooftops and the winding avenues of the imperial city. The streets were already alive with the sounds of commerce merchants calling out their goods, the creak of wooden cartwheels, the rhythmic clop of oxen's hooves on stone. At the center of this bustle, a golden palanquin moved slowly along the main road. Its silk curtains swayed gently with each step of the uniformed bearers. Guards flanked the sides, their armor glinting in the light, keeping the curious crowds at a respectful distance. Inside sat Emperor Daisho, dressed in layered robes of crimson and gold. He leaned slightly to one side, gazing out at his city through the part in the curtains. To most, it was a view of order and prosperity, but to Daisho, it felt like looking at a painting from behind glass. Distant, untouched. The procession reached a narrow stretch of road where the morning shadows still lingered. Here the market stalls gave way to smaller, rougher buildings, their wooden frames weathered, their roofs sagging under the weight of neglect. That's when the smell reached him. Sharp, metallic. It cut through the sweetness of the incense burning in the palanquin. Daisho pulled the curtain back further, and there, on the edge of the road, lay the body of a man. His clothes were ragged, his skin pale. A wooden begging bowl sat beside him, tipped on its side empty. No one in the crowd stopped. Some averted their eyes. Others stepped around the body without breaking stride. The emperor's hand tightened on the edge of the curtain. "Stop," he said. The bearers froze. The guards glanced at one another, unsure. "Open the door," Daisho commanded. The head guard bowed and slid the panel aside. In one smooth motion, the emperor stepped down from the palanquin and onto the cold stone street. Gasps rose from the crowd. An emperor did not walk the streets like this, certainly not in this quarter. Daisho moved to the beggar's side and knelt. The man was gone, his face slack, his breath stilled. For a moment, the emperor simply looked at him. The noise of the street faded. It was as if The two of them existed in a small pocket of stillness, cut off from the rest of the world. One of the guards spoke quietly. "My lord, we should return to the palace." Daisho shook his head. "Help me carry him." They found a small patch of ground near the city's edge, where a few wildflowers pushed through the dirt. The emperor knelt there, smoothing the earth with his own hands, the silk of his sleeves dragging in the soil. When the burial was done, he placed the empty begging bowl atop the mound. "May your hunger be filled in the next life," he whispered. When he rose, there was a lightness in his expression that had not been there before. He turned to his guards. If an emperor cannot walk among his people and touch the suffering that lives within his own city, then he rules nothing. From that day, Emperor Daisho made it a habit to leave the palanquin behind when traveling short distances. He walked the streets in plain clothes, speaking with merchants, laborers, and beggars alike. Some were startled, even fearful. Others smiled with relief, as if finally recognized. It's easy to pass by someone else's pain when it isn't touching you directly. But when was the last time you truly stopped to acknowledge it? If this story stirs something in you, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes your words might be the thing that makes someone feel seen. The memory of that morning stayed with Daisho for the rest of his reign. He continued to lead, but his leadership no longer came from above. It came from beside, and the city in time changed around him. But not all lessons arrive in moments of public service or royal humility. Some come in the quiet, unexpected ways our lives are set on fire, when everything we've built is reduced to ashes and we're left to decide whether to cling to the loss or step into something entirely new. That is where our next story will take us. The hut sat at the very edge of the forest where the pine trees thinned and the ground dropped away into a valley below. It was small, a single room of rough-hewn timber with a roof that sagged just slightly from years of snow and rain. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked chimney, carrying the faint scent of pine resin and old cedar. Inside lived a monk named Shoju. He had come here years ago, leaving the bustle of the monastery for the solitude of this mountainside. His days were simple: meditate at sunrise, tend a small vegetable garden, read the old sutras until the light faded. The forest was his temple, the wind in the trees, his chanting bell. For a long time it was enough. But in truth, Shoju's life had become comfortable. Too comfortable. He had carved out a space that kept him safe from distraction, from conflict, and perhaps, without realizing it, from growth. One winter evening, as the sun slipped behind the mountains, Shoju was sitting by the fire when a figure appeared at the door. It was an old woman from the village below, wrapped in a thick wool cloak. Her face was weathered, her eyes sharp. "Good evening, Master Shoju," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her gaze traveled around the hut, the neatly stacked firewood, the clean bowls, the carefully folded bedding. "You live well here." Shoju smiled faintly. "It is simple, but it serves me." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Too well," she said. Before Shoju could respond, she stepped back outside. And then, without a word, She dropped a lit torch onto the dry straw stacked against the hut. Flames leapt instantly, crackling and hissing, swallowing the walls in a rush of heat. Shoju's first impulse was to run for water, but he froze. There was no well nearby, no time to save anything. The fire roared fierce and unyielding. He stepped back, feeling the heat on his face, the smoke stinging his eyes. In the space of minutes, his home, every bowl, every robe, every book was gone. Only blackened beams and a circle of glowing embers remained. The old woman watched him silently. When the last of the flames died down, she said, "You were clinging to this hut like it was your practice, but the hut was only a shelter. You've mistaken the shelter for the path." Shoju stood there in the snow, the smell of smoke heavy in his robe. And for the first time in years, he felt unburdened. No possessions to protect, no place to retreat to, nothing between him and the raw, unfiltered world. That night he slept under the open sky. The stars were sharp and countless above him. The cold air bit at his skin, but his mind was still. In the weeks that followed, he began traveling again, visiting villages, teaching in marketplaces, meditating in temple courtyards. And he found that his practice was no weaker without the hut. In fact, it was freer. Sometimes the things we've built to support our growth can quietly become the walls that limit it. Have you ever had to let go of something not because it was bad, but because it had begun to hold you back? If this story speaks to you, share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience might help someone else find the courage to step out from their own hut. Shoju never rebuilt his home. He carried his life on his back and his practice in his heart. And when people asked where he lived, he would point to the horizon and say, "Wherever the fire hasn't reached yet." But not all treasures are lost to fire. Some are hidden so deeply inside us that we forget they exist until someone reminds us that we've been carrying them all along. That's the journey we'll take in our next story. A cold rain draped itself over the village like a grey curtain. The narrow streets glistened, the puddles rippling whenever a gust of wind funneled between the wooden houses. The scent of wet earth and damp straw hung in the air. Under the shelter of a small tea house awning, a farmer named Tanaka stood, with his shoulders hunched, staring out at the rain. His clothes were patched, his sandals worn thin, and his face carried the kind of weary lines that come from years of scraping by. For weeks now, he'd been telling anyone who would listen that his life was cursed. Every planting season brought bad weather. Every harvest brought low prices. And now, even the roof of his home had begun to leak. That afternoon, an old monk stopped at the tea house for a cup of hot tea. He noticed Tanaka's sour expression and the way he stared at the muddy street as though it were to blame for his troubles. "You look like a man who's lost something precious," the monk said gently. "I have," Tanaka replied without looking up. "I've lost any hope of things getting better?" The monk studied him for a moment, then said, "I wonder, would you help me with something?" Tanaka shrugged. "If it doesn't cost me anything, it won't," the monk said with a smile. "Come with me." They walked through the rain to the outskirts of the village. where a small weathered shrine stood beneath a large cedar tree. The monk stopped before the shrine and said, "Inside, this is a treasure house. It contains more than gold, more than jewels. It holds everything you've ever needed to live well." Tanaka gave him a skeptical look. If that were true, wouldn't everyone in the village be here already? The monk shook his head. The treasure house is locked, and the key can only be used by its owner. Today, I'm telling you that you are the owner. Something in Tanaka's chest tightened, a flicker of hope he tried to smother. "What are you talking about? Where is this key?" The monk reached out and touched the center of Tanaka's chest. "It's here." For a moment, neither spoke. Rain tapped steadily on the cedar branches above them. "You carry the treasure house within you," the monk continued. "Your ability to meet each day with courage. Your capacity to love and to forgive. Your awareness of the life that flows through you even now. These are not things anyone can give you or take from you. You have been standing outside your own treasure house begging for scraps when you could have walked inside at any time." Tanaka opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. He thought about the years he'd spent blaming the weather, the market, the roof, anything outside himself. And he realized the monk was right. His hands had never once reached for the key that was his to use. They stood together for a few more minutes in silence before the monk said, "You may still have storms. The harvest may still be poor. But if you live from inside the treasure house, these things will no longer own you." Tanaka felt something shift, small but unmistakable. As they walked back toward the village, the rain no longer seemed quite so cold. Sometimes we forget that we have the tools, the strengths, the treasures we need already inside us, and we spend years waiting for something outside to change. Has there been a time when you realized you were carrying more strength than you thought? If you're willing, share it in the comments. Your words might be the reminder someone else needs tonight. From that day on, Tanaka began each morning by placing his hand over his chest before stepping outside, not as a superstition, but as a quiet acknowledgement. The key is here. But knowing you have the key is one thing. Having the courage to open the door, especially when what's on the other side might change everything, is another. And that's exactly what our next story will ask us to face. The old monastery stood on a hillside overlooking a narrow valley. From a distance, it seemed peaceful. A cluster of wooden halls, curved rooftops, and winding stone paths, half hidden in the morning mist. But the closer you came, the more you could sense it, an almost tangible weight in the air. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't exactly welcome either. At the base of the hill, a tall wooden gate barred the way. Its planks were weathered and dark, the iron hinges rusted. Above the arch, a faded sign read, simply "No entry, without permission." For 3 days, a young seeker named Rio had camped just outside that gate. He'd come from far away, his pack light, his hope heavy. Every morning, he bowed deeply to the gate, then sat cross-legged before it, waiting for someone to invite him in. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, he curled up by the roadside fire and told himself, "Tomorrow, they'll open it." On the fourth morning, an elderly monk finally appeared. He wore a patched brown robe and carried a broom taller than he was. Without looking at Rio, he began sweeping the stones just inside the gate. Rio bowed low. "Honored sir, I wish to enter the monastery and train under your master." The monk's broom kept moving. "Then why are you sitting outside? I'm waiting for the gate to be opened," Rio said. At that, the monk finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "The gate has no lock," he said. Then, without another word, he returned to his sweeping. Rio blinked. No lock. He rose, stepped forward, and pushed. The heavy wood swung inward with almost no effort. The path into the monastery lay open sunlight spilling across it, like a welcome he had been imagining but never tested. Later that day, Rio was brought before the master of the monastery. The old monk sat on a low wooden platform, a teacup, steaming gently in his hands. "You waited outside for 3 days, the master said. "Why, I thought I needed permission," Rio admitted. The master nodded slowly. "And so you made the gate real even when it never was." The words landed like a stone in Rio's chest. How many other gates had he built for himself? How many times had he stood outside waiting for a sign that it was safe to enter that evening as he swept the courtyard alongside the same old monk who'd greeted him? Rio looked back at the gate. It stood open now, the path beyond empty and quiet. The sign above it hadn't changed, but somehow it seemed smaller, less convincing. Sometimes the barrier keeping us from what we seek isn't a wall someone else built. It's a story we've told ourselves about needing permission. Have you ever realized the gate in your life was never locked? If you feel like sharing, leave your story in the comments. You might help someone else take that first step forward. From then on, Rio made it a practice to test the gates he encountered in his training, in his relationships, even in his own thinking. And more often than not, he found that the hinges moved easily if he was willing to try. But not all gates open with a push. Some open only when you stop pushing entirely, when you drop your effort, your urgency, and let the moment unfold on its own. Our next story is about a lesson learned not through striving, but through the quiet surrender of a single step. The monastery's stone path wound its way along the side of the mountain, hugging the edge where the land dropped into a wide green valley below. On most mornings, the monks walked this path in single file, their sandals brushing softly against the stones, their robes swaying in unison like a line of wind-blown reeds. Among them was a young monk named Shinpo. He was tall, with a long, purposeful stride, and a gaze fixed always on the path ahead. If you asked him, he'd tell you his goal was clear: to reach the main hall as quickly as possible, to begin the day's meditation without wasting a moment. One morning, as the line of monks made their way along the path, Shinpo suddenly stopped mid-step. Not because he tripped, not because someone called his name. He simply stopped. The monk behind him nearly bumped into him. "Why are you standing still?" the monk whispered. Shinpo looked down at his raised foot, hovering just above the stone. He lowered it slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of his body settle into the earth. Then he looked up at the valley below. Mist curled along the treetops. A heron glided silently over the river, its wings catching the first light of the rising sun. Somewhere in the distance, a farmer's dog barked twice and then fell silent. It was as if, for the first time, Shinpo realized he had been walking through all of this without truly seeing any of it. When the monks reached the hall, the abbot noticed Shinpo's delayed arrival. "You are late," the abbot said, though not unkindly. "I stopped walking," Shinpo replied. The abbot raised an eyebrow. "And what did you find in your stopping?" Shinpo hesitated, searching for words. "I found that I was already here even before I arrived." The abbot smiled faintly. "Then your stopping was your arrival." From that day, Shinpo's pace changed. He still walked the same path each morning, but he allowed his eyes, his breath, and his heart to match the rhythm of the world around him. Sometimes he stopped mid-stride to watch the light change on the river, or to feel the wind shift in the pines. And each time, he found that the destination was not the point the path was. Soft CTA here. How often do you rush towards something only to realize you missed what was all around you? If you've had a moment where slowing down showed you something important, share it in the comments. Your story might remind someone else to take that pause they've been avoiding. In time, the other monks began to notice. They too found themselves slowing not because they were told to, but because they'd seen the quiet clarity in Shinpo's eyes. The path to the hall became a little less hurried, a little more alive. But while Shinpo's lesson came from stopping mid-stride, our next story comes from a teacher who never seemed to stop at all, at least not when someone asked for an answer. Instead, he gave something else entirely, silence, so deep it was almost louder than words. The rain had been falling all afternoon, a soft, steady curtain that blurred the edges of the temple garden. Water trickled along the grooves of the stone paths, pooled briefly in shallow depressions, and overflowed into the grass. From the meditation hall, you could hear the rain's rhythm tapping against the wooden shutters, a quiet music that made the air feel heavier, slower. A young monk sat just inside the doorway, staring at the wet garden beyond. His name was Kosho, and he was wrestling with a question that had haunted him for months. It wasn't about a sutra. It wasn't about temple duties. It was about a person, someone he had loved deeply and lost. Every time he sat to meditate, their face rose before him. Every time he tried to focus on his breath, memories returned uninvited. The way they laughed, the way they looked away when embarrassed, the way their absence now felt like a stone pressing on his chest. That day, unable to bear the weight any longer, Kosho rose and walked to the abbot's quarters. The master, an older man named Ryotan, was sitting at a low table pouring tea. The steam curled upward between them. Kosho bowed deeply. "Master, I cannot let go of this person. I've tried everything, meditation, chanting, work, but they remain in my mind. Why can't I forget?" Ryotan looked at him for a long moment. Then he set his teacup down and said nothing. The silence stretched. Kosho shifted uncomfortably. He waited for advice, for a teaching story, for something. But the master simply looked at him, his eyes steady, his breath slow. Seconds passed, then minutes. The sound of the rain filled the space between them. Finally, Kosho felt his own breathing match the master's. His shoulders loosened. The restless buzzing in his mind began to fade. And he realized without words that the silence itself was the answer. Some things are not solved by more thought, more effort, more trying. Some things dissolve only when you stop feeding them with attention. Kosho bowed again, this time without expectation. The master poured him tea, still without speaking. They drank together in the soft company of the rain. Sometimes the answer you're looking for isn't another idea to add to your mind, it's the space to let the question rest. Have you ever found clarity not from talking but from a moment of quiet? If so, share it in the comments. Your story might help someone else see the value of stillness. From that day, Kosho's question didn't disappear immediately, but it lost its sharpness. And in time it became just another ripple in the pond of his mind, rising, falling, gone. This was not the only time Ryotan answered without words. In fact, in our next story, another monk will find that the master's silence is not emptiness, but a mirror reflecting exactly what the seeker has brought to it. The master's quarters were not grand. A single low table sat near the window, a cushion beside it. On the wall there hung only one object, a round polished mirror framed in dark wood. Its surface was so clear it seemed to draw in the light from the paper screens and give it back softer, warmer. One afternoon, a monk named Hanto was sent to deliver tea to Master Ryotan. When he arrived, the master was away, but the door was left slightly open. Hanto hesitated at the threshold, then stepped inside. The room felt unusually still, as if it were holding its breath. His eyes drifted to the mirror. He saw his own face reflected, his brows slightly furrowed, his lips pressed together. Without meaning to, he straightened his posture. Strange, he thought. I didn't realize I looked so tense. When Ryotan returned, he noticed Hanto's gaze fixed on the mirror. Do you like it? The master asked, setting down a bundle of firewood. It's beautiful, Hanto admitted. But why do you have it here? You've never struck me as someone who cares about appearance. Ryotan smiled faintly. The mirror doesn't exist for vanity. It exists for truth. Hanto frowned. Truth. Come closer, Ryotan said. Hanto stepped forward until he was just a breath away from the glass. He could see every detail of his face now. The faint scar near his temple, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes, the way one eyebrow arched higher than the other. The mirror shows exactly what is there, Ryotan said. It does not flatter. It does not criticize. It simply reflects. This is how the mind should be when someone comes to you with their troubles, empty of judgment, yet completely clear. Hanto's eyes stayed on his reflection. Is that how you listen to us? Master Ryotan nodded. When you speak to me, I try to be like this mirror, to give back only what you've brought, so you can see it for yourself." For a moment, Hanto was silent. Then he remembered all the times he had left the master's room, thinking he'd been given an answer only to realize later that the answer had come from his own words, his own seeing. "Master," he said slowly, "what if someone comes here and doesn't like what they see in the mirror?" Ryotan met his gaze through the glass. Then they've been given a gift, the chance to meet themselves honestly. And from there, they can choose what to do next. Hanto left that day with the image of the mirror fixed in his mind. He began to notice how often he distorted what he saw in others, coloring it with his own opinions, expectations, and fears. Little by little, he practiced being a clearer mirror. Sometimes the most helpful thing we can offer is not advice, not solutions, but a clear reflection, letting someone see themselves without our edits. Have you ever had a moment where someone simply listened and in that space you found your own answer? If so, share it in the comments. Your story might inspire someone else to offer that kind of listening. From then on, whenever Hanto felt the urge to interrupt or fix, he imagined the round mirror in the master's room. And more often than not, silence became the truest response he could give. But sometimes the truth we see reflected back isn't gentle. Sometimes it shakes the ground under our feet and forces us to let go of a certainty we've been holding for far too long. That is where our next story will lead us. The meditation hall was quiet, except for the faint creak of floorboards as the monks shifted their positions during the long afternoon sitting. Light filtered through the paper screens, drawing pale rectangles across the tatami mats. Outside, a light breeze stirred the temple's wind chimes, their tones barely audible inside the hall. In the far corner sat Kenji, a young monk known for his fierce dedication. He practiced harder than anyone rising before dawn, meditating long after the evening bell, pushing his mind to the edge of exhaustion in search of enlightenment. One day the abbot summoned Kenji to his quarters. When Kenji bowed and sat, the abbot asked only one question. "Tell me, what is the sound of one hand?" Kenji froze. He had heard of koans, these strange, impossible riddles Zen masters gave their students, but he had never been assigned one until now. "The sound of one hand," he repeated. The abbot's face gave nothing away. "Yes, bring me your answer tomorrow." That night, Kenji barely slept. He clapped one hand against his thigh, rubbed his palm against the tatami, snapped his fingers into the empty air. None of it felt right. Every sound came from contact, from two things meeting. But what could one hand alone produce? The next day, he returned to the abbot with his best attempt. He waved his hand through the air. The abbot shook his head. Kenji tried again the following day, slapping his hand against his chest. The abbot remained silent. Weeks passed. Each time Kenji brought a new sound, a new theory, and each time the abbot dismissed it with a gentle shake of the head. Frustration began to boil in Kenji's chest. He was used to problems that could be solved with effort, with sheer persistence. But this question resisted him at every turn. One evening, after yet another failed attempt, Kenji stormed out of the abbot's room and wandered the temple grounds. He found himself beneath the old pine tree at the edge of the courtyard, the same one he'd passed 1,000 times without really seeing. The wind moved through its branches, making a low, sighing sound. Kenji closed his eyes. The sound wasn't coming from the pine alone, nor from the wind alone. It was from the meeting of the two. And yet, the tree stood there whether the wind touched it or not. The wind moved whether the tree stood there or not. And suddenly, the question wasn't about sound at all. It was about seeing the place where the need for two falls away. The place where the hand and everything else simply is. The next morning, Kenji returned to the abbot's room. This time, he said nothing. He simply bowed, lifted one hand, and held it there utterly still. The abbot smiled. At last, you've stopped trying to make a sound and begun to hear. Some questions can't be answered by adding more effort, only by letting go of the need to solve them. Have you ever had a problem that only became clear when you stopped wrestling with it? If so, share it in the comments. You might help someone else release their grip too. From then on, Kenji carried the koan with him, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a reminder to listen for what's always been there, even in silence. But while Kenji's lesson came from stillness, our next story will take us to a place of sudden startling action when a single moment on a dusty road shattered a traveler's assumptions about what compassion really looks like. The road stretched wide and dusty under the afternoon sun. On either side, fields of tall grass swayed in the breeze, whispering against one another like quiet gossip. In the distance, the faint outline of mountains shimmered in the heat. At the center of this open landscape stood a crossroads. 4 paths met there, marked only by a weathered post leaning slightly to the east. Beneath the post sat an old woman, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. A large woven basket rested beside her, covered with a square of faded cloth. A traveler named Masao approached from the north road. He had been walking for days, his sandals worn thin, his throat dry. When he saw the old woman, he thought she might be selling food or water. Bowing politely, he said, "Grandmother, can you tell me which road leads to the capital?" The woman looked at him with eyes as calm as a still pond. "That depends," she said. "Are you traveling to find something or to leave something behind?" Masao blinked. I suppose to find something," he answered, though he wasn't sure why the question unsettled him. The old woman nodded and pointed to the east road. "That way." He thanked her, but as he stepped past, she called after him. "If you had said to leave something behind, I would have pointed west." Masao stopped. "That makes no sense. Surely one road must be faster or safer than the other." The old woman lifted the cloth from her basket. Inside were 2 identical loaves of bread, round and golden, still faintly warm. She placed one in his hands. "Both roads will feed you. Both will test you. But only you know whether you are moving toward or away." Masao stared at the bread, confused. "Why does it matter?" he asked. she smiled faintly. Because the road will seem longer if you do not know why you are on it. Masao bowed again more deeply this time and chose the east road. As he walked, the weight of the loaf in his pack reminded him of her words. And he began to realize that he had not been entirely honest, not with her and not with himself. Perhaps he was not searching for something after all. Perhaps he was running from it. By the time the sun dipped low, he still wasn't sure which was true. But he knew this whichever road he was on, it was his, to walk with eyes open. Sometimes we ask for directions when what we really need is to decide why we're traveling in the first place. Have you ever realized you were walking a path without knowing your true reason for it? If you feel like sharing, leave your reflection in the comments. Your story might help someone else choose their own road with more clarity. Masao would think of the old woman many times in the years ahead. Not because she told him which way to go, but because she reminded him that knowing why mattered more than knowing where. Our next story will take us from the crossroads to a cliffside where another traveler will learn that the only way forward sometimes requires letting go of every plan, every safety, and every bit of ground beneath your feet. The path narrowed as it climbed toward the mountains, winding between sharp outcroppings of rock and clusters of twisted pine. The air was thin here, cool enough that each breath felt cleaner, sharper. Far below, a river threaded its way through the valley, its surface catching glints of sunlight like scattered coins. A traveler named Kaoru had been walking this path for most of the day. His goal was simple: to reach the hermitage said to be hidden high in these mountains, where a legendary teacher lived in seclusion. Every step had brought him closer until the path ended abruptly at the edge of a gorge. It wasn't wide, maybe 15 feet across, but the drop was dizzying the river below, roaring through jagged stone. There was no bridge, no rope, no safe way around. Kaoru stepped to the edge and peered down. The wind funneled through the chasm, carrying the damp cold smell of the river. He felt it tug at his sleeves as if daring him to try. Just then, an old man appeared on the opposite side. He was small, almost wiry, with a walking stick in one hand. Looking for the hermitage, he called. "Yes," Kaoru replied, "but there's no way across." The old man smiled faintly. "There is. You just can't see it from where you stand." Kaoru scanned the cliff face. No hidden plank, no rope ladder, no stones forming a bridge. "Then tell me," he said. "How do I get there?" The old man's eyes softened. "You leap." Kaoru's stomach tightened. "That's impossible. I'll fall." The man shrugged. "Then you will not reach the hermitage." For a long time, Kaoru stood there, the wind pushing at his back. His mind spun through calculations, the distance, the risk, the countless things that could go wrong. And yet, a small stubborn part of him wondered, what if I can? He stepped back, felt the earth firm under his feet, and took a long breath. Without giving himself time to reconsider, he ran forward and pushed off the edge. For a moment, there was only the rush of air, the weightless arc over the void. Then his feet hit solid ground, knees bending to absorb the landing. he was across. The old man nodded once as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world and began walking toward the path that led upward. Sometimes he said over his shoulder, "You can't know. The ground will be there until you land on it." Kauru followed, his heart still pounding, but lighter now. The gorge remained behind him, but the feeling of having crossed it, of having leapt, stayed in his chest like a quiet flame. Sometimes the gap between where you are and where you want to be can't be crossed by planning, waiting, or preparing, only by leaping. Have you ever taken a step that felt impossible until you were already on the other side? If so, share it in the comments. Your leap might give someone else the courage to take theirs. As Kauru and the old man climbed higher, the path grew steeper, the air thinner, and soon they would reach a place where even leaping wasn't enough, where Kauru would have to face not the gap between cliffs, but the gap between what he thought he was seeking and what was waiting for him instead. By the time Kauru and the old man reached the final bend in the mountain path, the sun was low, turning the peaks a deep shade of gold. The air was so thin now that each breath felt like it had to be earned. The old man led him to a narrow clearing where a simple wooden hut stood beneath the shadow of a towering cedar. "This is it," the man said. Kauru felt a ripple of relief and a pulse of anticipation. Months of travel days of climbing, even the leap over the gorge, all for this moment. The hermitage of the legendary teacher was right here. The old man gestured toward the door. "She's inside. Go to her." Kauru bowed, stepped forward and slid the wooden panel open. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. A low table, a cushion, and shelves of weathered scrolls filled the small room. But there was no one there. He stepped inside, expecting the teacher to emerge from a side room, but the hut was silent. He checked behind the partition, empty. Outside, the old man was already gone. Kauru sat heavily on the cushion, confusion knotting in his chest. Had he been misled? Was this some test he didn't understand? After a while, he noticed a single object on the table, a small bronze mirror no larger than his palm. It reflected his own face back at him, flushed from the climb, eyes sharp with expectation and disappointment. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring at his reflection. And slowly a strange truth began to surface. He had come here expecting the teacher to give him something. Wisdom, answers, perhaps a blessing. But what if the teacher had nothing to give? What if the teacher was never anyone but himself? The thought made him laugh, a sound that surprised him in the stillness. He picked up the mirror, looked once more into his own eyes, and whispered, "So, here you are." Kauru stayed in the hut for the night, not because he was waiting for the teacher to appear, but because he no longer felt the need to leave immediately. When morning came, he slid the mirror into his pack and stepped back onto the trail, the mountains stretching endlessly ahead. Sometimes we travel great distances searching for a teacher only to find that the one we were meant to meet has been with us all along. Have you ever had a moment where you realized the guidance you were looking for was already inside you? If so, share it in the comments. Your story might be the mirror someone else needs. As Kauru descended the mountain, the memory of the old man and the empty hut stayed with him, and he began to wonder if the teacher was himself. Then what other teachers had he already met without recognizing them? Our next story will take us to a busy riverside market, where a lesson about teachers will arrive in the most unexpected form, from someone who never claimed to be one at all. The riverside market was alive with sound. Merchants shouted over one another to advertise their goods, bowls of dyed silk baskets of persimmons, bundles of fragrant herbs. Children darted between stalls, their laughter rising above the hum of bargaining voices. Beyond the rows of merchants, the wide brown river glimmered in the afternoon sun. Kauru had been walking for hours when he reached the pier at the far edge of the market. He planned to cross the river to continue his journey, but the small ferry that served the stretch of water sat tied to the dock empty. Only a single man stood nearby, leaning against a weathered post, his hands resting loosely on a long wooden pole. "You the boatman?" Kauru asked. The man nodded. "Ferry leaves when it's ready." Kauru glanced at the empty deck. "When it's ready, you mean when there are more passengers?" The boatman smiled faintly. "Not exactly. The river tells me when to go." Kauru frowned, unsure if this was a joke or some local superstition. He was about to press for an answer when the boatman pointed to the water. "Look closely." At first, Kauru saw only the usual current, the lazy surface rippling under the light breeze. Then he noticed something else, the faint swirl of an eddy loosening the small floating leaves beginning to drift downstream more quickly. "Wind's shifting," the boatman said. "The current will carry us easier if we wait just a little longer." Sure enough, a few minutes later, the pull of the river changed. The boatman untied the rope, pushed off with his pole, and let the ferry glide into the current. As they moved across the water, Kauru asked, "Have you always known how to read the river like that?" The boatman shook his head. "When I was younger, I used to fight it. Push hard against the current. Try to cross as fast as possible. I always ended up tired, sometimes drifting farther downstream than I wanted. It took me years to learn that the river does most of the work if you let it." Kauru watched the boatman steer using small, almost effortless movements. The ferry moved steadily toward the opposite shore, carried as much by the water's flow as by the man's hands. "It's the same in other parts of life," the boatman added. "You can row like mad in the wrong moment, or you can wait until the current shifts. Both will get you across, but only one will leave you with enough strength for what's next." When they reached the far bank, Kauru stepped off the ferry feeling lighter, though he wasn't sure if it was from the short ride or the lesson tucked quietly inside it. Have you ever tried to force something to happen only to realize it flowed better when you waited for the right moment? If you're comfortable, share that experience in the comments. It might be the reminder Someone else needs to stop fighting their own river. As Kauru turned to thank the boatman, the man simply raised a hand in farewell and pushed the ferry back into the water. The river caught it instantly, carrying him downstream, pole resting lightly in his hands. The river had given Kauru a lesson in timing. But his next encounter would give him something else entirely. A lesson in trust offered not by a stranger but by someone who seemed to know him. Before he even spoke a word, the sun had slipped behind the hills, leaving the road in that soft grey light between day and night. Kauru's legs ached from walking. His pack felt heavier with every step, the straps digging into his shoulders. He had passed no villages for hours, and the idea of sleeping outside again was beginning to weigh on him. Then, just as the road curved around a grove of cypress trees, he saw it a small roadside inn with a paper lantern glowing warmly above the door. The painted characters on the sign swayed gently in the evening breeze. Kauru stepped inside, the floorboards creaking softly under his feet. The scent of miso and wood smoke wrapped around him like a blanket. Behind the low counter stood an innkeeper, a woman in her 60s with silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, and eyes that seemed to notice everything at once. Before Kauru could introduce himself, she said, "You've come far today, Kauru." He froze. They had never met. "How do you know my name?" The innkeeper smiled. Not in the way of someone revealing a trick, but in the way of someone recognizing an old friend. "I've been expecting you." Confused but too tired to argue, Kauru followed her to a small room at the back. A futon had already been laid out. On the low table sat a steaming bowl of rice, grilled fish, and hot tea. As he ate, Kauru asked, "Who told you I would be here?" "No one," the innkeeper said. "People arrive when they're meant to. You looked like a man who's been carrying questions, and those questions have a way of guiding a person's steps." Later, as Kauru prepared to sleep, the innkeeper returned with a folded blanket. She placed it beside him and said, "Whatever path you're on, remember that not every place you rest is a place you were lost. Sometimes it's just where you needed to pause." That night, Kauru slept deeper than he had in weeks. When he woke at dawn, the room was empty, except for his pack and the folded blanket. The innkeeper was nowhere to be found. Even the lantern outside had gone dark, as if the inn itself had been no more than a dream. He stepped back onto the road with a strange feeling, lighter, but also watched over somehow, as though the woman's eyes still followed him with quiet assurance. Have you ever had someone appear in your life at just the right time in a way that felt almost fated? If so, share your story in the comments. It might be the sign someone else needs to trust their own timing. As Kauru walked on, he couldn't shake the feeling that the innkeeper's welcome had been less about who he was and more about who he was becoming. Soon, he would meet someone else who seemed to know him. Without introduction, but this meeting would take place under an open sky with a teacher whose words were as spare and direct as the wind itself. By midday, the road Kauru followed had widened into an open plain. Tall grasses swayed in the breeze, the sound of their movement like a constant whisper beneath the clear sky. Far ahead, he noticed a small group gathered near a wooden target set against a row of posts. At the center stood an archer, a man in a simple robe holding a long bow polished from years of use. Curious Kauru approached and stood at the edge of the group. The archer nocked an arrow, drew the string back slowly, and released. The arrow flew straight and true, landing in the center of the target with a deep, satisfying thunk. The small crowd murmured with admiration, but the archer didn't smile. Instead, he turned to Kauru as if he had been expecting him. "You've been traveling a long way," he said. Kauru nodded cautiously. "I have been searching for lessons." The archer gestured for him to step closer. He handed Kauru the bow and a single arrow. "Then here's one, hit the target." Kauru had never used a bow before, but he did his best to imitate what he'd seen. He raised the bow, drew the string back, and let go. The arrow missed, entirely sinking into the grass several feet away. The archer didn't comment. He simply handed Kauru another arrow. Again. Kauru tried once more and missed again. Frustration rose in his chest. He turned to the archer. "What am I doing wrong?" The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "You are aiming for the target." Kauru blinked. "Isn't that the point?" The archer shook his head. "The target is not your goal. Your goal is to become so steady, so present, that the release is effortless. When that happens, the arrow finds its own way." He motioned for Kauru to try again. This time, Kauru took a slow breath before lifting the bow. He felt the weight of the wood in his hands, the stretch of the string, the cool air on his face. He let the arrow go without thinking about the target at all. It struck the outer edge of the board far from the center, but on it nonetheless. The archer nodded. "Better. Now forget the board entirely. When you can release without clinging to where the arrow will land, you'll be closer to hitting the true mark." Kauru lowered the bow, realizing the lesson was less about archery and more about the countless aims he had been chasing in his life. Sometimes his grip on the outcome was the very thing that kept him from reaching it. Have you ever noticed that the harder you chase something, the more it slips away? But when you let go, it seems to come naturally. If so, share your story in the comments. Your insight might help someone else ease their aim. Kauru thanked the archer and handed the bow back. The man gave him a small smile, then turned back to his practice, each arrow released as calmly as a breath. Kauru walked away carrying the weight of the bow in his memory, and a question in his heart if releasing the arrow meant not clinging to the outcome. What would that mean for the other things he was still holding on to so tightly? That question would follow him into his next encounter. One that took place not in the openness of a plain, but in the intimate quiet of a garden at night. The village where Kauru arrived that evening was small and quiet, its houses huddled close together as if whispering secrets to one another. By the time he found lodging, the sky had deepened into a velvety blue, the first stars just beginning to appear. After a simple meal, he wandered into the inn's back garden, drawn by the faint glow of a lantern among the trees. The garden was enclosed by a low wooden fence, its path winding between stones slick with dew. A single paper lantern hung from the branch of an old cherry tree. Its light was soft, trembling slightly in the cool night air, casting long shadows over the moss-covered ground. An elderly woman knelt nearby, trimming a cluster of late-blooming chrysanthemums. She looked up as Kauru approached and smiled warmly. "You've found the heart of the garden?" she said. Kauru glanced at the lantern. "It's beautiful. But why only one? The path would be brighter with more." The woman shook her head gently. "Too much light blinds the eyes. A single lantern lets you see just enough to take the next step." Kauru stood still, letting his eyes adjust. The garden began to reveal itself in layers: the gleam of water in a small stone basin, the rough texture of the old cherry bark, the delicate sway of a spider's web in the breeze. The lantern's glow didn't show everything, but it showed enough. The woman set down her shears and gestured toward the dark corners of the garden. When you can't see the whole path, some people freeze, others rush forward and stumble. But if you move slowly, trusting that each step will reveal the next, you'll always find your way. Kauru felt the truth of her words settle in his chest. He thought of his own journey, the places he had hesitated because he couldn't see the ending, the times he had tried to force clarity before it was ready to arrive. Have you ever found yourself needing just enough light to move forward instead of seeing the whole road ahead? If so, share that moment in the comments. Your story might help someone else take their next step with more trust. Kauru bowed to the woman and turned back toward the inn. The lantern's light followed him, part of the way, then faded as he rounded the corner, leaving him in the dark. But his steps were steady. By morning, the cherry tree and its lantern would be behind him. Ahead lay another lesson, this one about the weight we carry without realizing it, and the freedom that comes from finally setting it down. Morning mist clung to the low hills as Kauru made his way out of the village. The road soon led him to a wooden bridge spanning a slow-moving river, its surface rippling faintly in the pale light. The boards beneath his feet creaked softly with each step, the sound carrying out over the water. Halfway across, he saw a man sitting on the railing. Beside him rested a large bundle wrapped tightly in cloth and bound with rope. The man looked to be in his 40s, his face weathered but his eyes bright. As Kauru drew closer, the man nodded in greeting. "Traveler, do you mind helping me?" "What's in the bundle?" Kauru asked. The man smiled faintly. "Things I no longer need." He stood, lifted the bundle with both hands, and held it out toward Kauru. "Take it to the other side for me." Kauru grasped the bundle and nearly stumbled. It was heavier than it looked, pressing down on his arms, pulling at his shoulders. "What's in here?" he asked again, straining under the weight. "Regrets," the man said simply, "and fears, and all the arguments I never stopped replaying in my mind." Kauru looked at him, unsure whether to take it seriously. "Why carry it at all?" The man shrugged. "I thought I had to, until I realized I could leave it behind." Kauru walked the rest of the way across the bridge, the bundle growing heavier with each step. When he reached the far side, he turned back, but the man was gone. Only the mist remained curling along the water like slow-moving breath. Kauru set the bundle down on the bank. For a long moment, he considered untying it, but something stopped him. Instead, he placed both hands on the rope, gave a gentle push, and watched as the bundle slid into the river. It bobbed once, then drifted away the current, carrying it out of sight. The space in his arms and in his chest felt unexpectedly light. Sometimes we don't realize how much we are carrying until we set it down. Have you ever let go of something, a memory, a fear, a burden, and felt the weight lift instantly? If you feel like sharing, tell your story in the comments. It might give someone else permission to release what they've been holding. Kauru stood on the riverbank for a while, listening to the quiet. Then he turned and followed the path onward, his steps easier, his shoulders free. The bundle was gone, but the lesson stayed. And in the days ahead, Kauru would discover that sometimes the heaviest loads aren't in our arms or on our backs, but in the way we hold ourselves apart from others. The afternoon sun was warm but not harsh, its light slanting gently through the branches overhead. Kauru had been walking for hours when he came across a small roadside clearing. In the center stood a makeshift stall no more than a table, 2 stools, and a clay pot set over a small charcoal brazier. A man sat behind the table, slowly pouring tea from the pot into 2 cups. Without looking up, he gestured for Kauru to join him. "You look like you've been walking a while," the man said. Kauru hesitated. He hadn't planned to stop, but the smell of the tea, earthy, faintly sweet, seemed to reach into his bones. He took the empty stool. The man slid a cup toward him. "Drink." Kauru took a sip. The warmth spread through his hands first, then into his chest. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the soft hiss of the brazier and the rustle of leaves overhead. Finally, Kauru asked, "Do you serve tea to everyone who passes by?" The man nodded. "Everyone who accepts. And if someone refuses?" The man shrugged. They keep walking. But sometimes, years later, they come back. Not for the tea, but for the moment they realized they could have taken it. Kauru studied the man's face. There was no urgency there, no expectation. He seemed entirely at ease with whether Kauru stayed or left. After they finished the first cup, the man poured another. Kauru accepted it without a word, feeling the quiet between them settle like a soft blanket. For the first time in days, he wasn't thinking about where he was going or what he was seeking. He was simply here. When the second cup was empty, Kauru set it down and stood. "Thank you," he said. The man only smiled. "The tea is just tea. What you do with the moment is yours." Kauru left the clearing with no token, no lesson written down, only the memory of sitting with a stranger and sharing something without needing a reason. Sometimes the smallest gestures, a shared drink, a quiet moment, are the ones that stay with us the longest. Have you ever had a brief encounter that left an outsized mark on you? If so, share it. In the comments, your memory might remind someone else to slow down for the next cup of tea life offers them. The road ahead curved into the hills where the late afternoon light turned the grass a golden green. Kauru walked on lighter than before, carrying nothing more than the taste of warm tea and the ease of a conversation that needed no words. But in the coming days, he would be reminded that not every meeting is so peaceful. Some bring challenge, even discomfort, and yet those moments can carry a lesson just as deep. The road narrowed as it approached the edge of a walled town. Ahead, a tall wooden gate stood open, its heavy doors bound in dark iron. Just outside, two men faced each other, their voices raised, their expressions sharp with frustration. Kauru slowed his steps. The men were arguing about something on the ground between them, a simple sack tied at the top with coarse rope. From the way they each had a hand on it, Kauru guessed neither intended to let go. "This is mine," the first man said, his grip tightening. "I bought it this morning in the market." The second man shook his head. "You dropped it on the road. I picked it up. That makes it mine now." Their voices rose and fell, the same points repeated in slightly different words over and over. Neither seemed to notice Kauru watching. Finally, an old woman emerged from behind the gate. She walked slowly, leaning on a cane, but her voice was clear. "What's in the sack?" she asked. "Rice," the first man said. "Enough to feed my family for a week." "Then why," she asked, "are you wasting the morning starving each other?" The two men glanced at one another. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the first man loosened his grip just enough for the second to do the same. The old woman stepped between them, untied the rope, and poured half the rice into a second sack she carried over her shoulder. She handed one to each man. "There. Now both your families will eat tonight." Kauru watched as the men, still muttering under their breath, walked their separate ways. The old woman caught his eye and gave a small nod before disappearing back through the gate. As he resumed walking, Kauru couldn't help but think about all the times he had clung tightly to something, not because he truly needed it, but because he couldn't bear for someone else to have it. Sometimes, the grip was the heavier burden. Have you ever realized you were holding on to something? An object, a point of view, even an argument that was costing you more than it gave? If so, share your story in the comments. It might help someone else see what they can set down today. The gate grew smaller behind him as Kauru continued down the road. Ahead, the sky was beginning to gather clouds, and with them a hush that promised rain. And it would be in that rain, standing under the wide eaves of a temple porch, that Kauru would receive one of his most unexpected lessons, yet from someone who spoke less with words and more with the stillness between them. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened into a solid grey ceiling. The first drops began to fall as Kauru crossed a narrow stone bridge, each one darkening the pale surface before rolling into the water below. Within minutes, the rain had deepened to a steady curtain, blurring the hills and soaking the road. He spotted a temple just off the path, its wooden eaves stretching wide over a porch. Grateful for shelter, Kauru hurried toward it and stepped under the roof, shaking the water from his sleeves. There, seated cross-legged, near the corner, was a monk in a simple grey robe. The rain drummed on the roof above, spilling from the eaves in silver streams. The monk's eyes were half closed, his hands resting lightly in his lap, unmoving. Kauru gave a small bow. "May I wait here until the rain passes?" The monk inclined his head but said nothing. So Kauru sat. The air was cool, filled with the scent of wet earth and cedar. They listened together as the rain shifted in tempo, faster, slower sometimes, so soft it was barely there before swelling again. After a long while, Kauru spoke. "Do you meditate here often?" The monk opened his eyes. "This is not meditation. This is just sitting in the rain." Kauru smiled faintly. "Is there a difference?" The monk's gaze returned to the curtain of falling water. In meditation, you may be trying to do something to still the mind to reach a state. When you sit in the rain, you simply sit in the rain. Kauru let the words sink in. He noticed how his own breathing had slowed without him trying. The sound of the rain was no longer background noise, it was everything. When the downpour eased to a light drizzle, Kauru stood and bowed again. "Thank you," he said. The monk didn't respond, only closed his eyes once more. Kauru stepped back onto the road, the scent of rain following him. Have you ever had a moment where you stopped trying to do something and simply let yourself be in it? If so, share it in the comments. Your experience might help someone else remember the quiet they already carry. As Kauru walked on, the sky began to lighten in the west, breaking into pale gold. But the calm he carried now had little to do with the weather. It was the kind that stays even when the rain starts again. That calm would be tested soon enough, for his next encounter would bring him to a place not of stillness, but of movement, where a lesson in presence would come from something as fleeting as a single step. The road curved toward a small temple gate, its wooden frame painted deep red, weathered in places to a muted rose. The late afternoon light angled low, touching the worn stones of the entry path. Kauru slowed his pace, feeling something shift in the air, a quiet. That was not just the absence of sound, but the presence of attention. An elderly monk stood by the gate, sweeping fallen leaves into a neat pile. The bristles of the broom whispered across the stone with each stroke. When Kauru reached the entrance, the monk looked up and smiled. "Traveler," he said, "you may enter, but only if you take one step with your whole being." Kauru tilted his head. "I don't understand." The monk leaned on his broom. "Most steps are only half taken. Part of you is already thinking of the next. Here you must take just one, nothing before it, nothing after it. Only the step itself." Kauru placed his pack on the ground, feeling the weight leave his shoulders. He closed his eyes, drew a slow breath and let it out. When he stepped forward, he felt the pressure of his heel on the stone, the shift of his weight through the arch of his foot, the roll to his toes before they left the ground. The step was ordinary, and yet it seemed to last longer than any step he had ever taken. The monk's smile deepened. "Now you may enter." Kauru passed through the gate and into the courtyard beyond. The air felt different inside, lighter as if the space itself honored that single, undivided step. They walked together toward the main hall, the monk speaking softly. When you can take one step completely, you can take another. And when each step is whole, your path is already complete. Have you ever caught yourself rushing through moments without truly being in them? If so, share your reflection in the comments. Your reminder might help someone else slow down for their own next step. Kauru left the temple later that evening, the sun low behind him. The road ahead no longer seemed a line to be finished, but a series of single, perfect steps. And it would be with that awareness of the power in one complete moment that he would arrive at the final chapter of his journey, where the lesson would not be about seeking or stepping at all, but about resting and letting the journey dissolve into the night. The last of the light was fading when Kauru reached the lake. It lay in a hollow between the hills, perfectly still, reflecting the rising moon so clearly that it was hard to tell where the water ended and the sky began. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Kauru dropped his pack and sat at the edge of the water. The ripples from his arrival spread outward, then vanished, leaving the surface smooth again. It was the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own heartbeat. Somewhere across the lake, a night bird called once. The sound floated over the water and disappeared into the dark. Kauru let his shoulders relax, the tension of the road slipping away. He thought of the many lessons he had gathered from the old woman at the crossroads, the leap over the gorge, the mirror in the empty hut, the boatman who waited for the current, the archer's arrow, the lantern in the garden, the bundle on the bridge, the tea with a stranger, the monk in the rain, and the step across the threshold. Each one had been like a stone dropped into his life, sending ripples far beyond the moment itself. As the moon rose higher, its light silvered the surface of the lake. Kauru lay back on the grass, gazing upward. The stars felt close enough to touch, though he knew they were impossibly far away. And yet, here they were above him. Here he was, beneath them. Nothing to chase, nothing to reach. The night air cooled further, and Kauru pulled his cloak around him. Somewhere deep in his chest, there was the faintest echo of all the voices and silences he had met along the way. A reminder that the journey was never really about the destination, but about how you arrive at the place you are in now. Before you drift off tonight, maybe take a moment to think about your own lake, that still place in you where everything settles, even if just for a little while. If you feel like sharing, leave a comment about what that place looks or feels like for you. You might just help someone else remember that their own calm is never far away. The moon climbed higher still, and the surface of the water seemed to blur as though the lake itself were closing its eyes. Kauru's breathing slowed. The cool grass beneath him, the weight of the blanket of night above him, the faint lapping of water against the shore. It all folded around him like a final, wordless lesson. He didn't know when sleep took him only, that it came gently without asking, as natural as the moon's reflection on the still water. And so the journey rested, here not ended, not forgotten, just resting like you are now. End of script. Sweet dreams.